I feel like there should be some Mission Impossible music as I step up here, because obviously it's come back to this a number of times already today. Throw in Brexit, I might as well leave now. So I'm going to try and talk you through some case study examples of where brownfield development has been enabled through more innovative solutions. And it's been actually quite inspiring over the last, well, since 2007, to be honest, to see how the public sector has responded in terms of ways in which to unlock development and the innovative thinking that's been out there. So I'm going to depress you for a little while and then try and give you a little bit of good news at the end. Oh, we'll ignore that. Okay, so first of all, why are there new funding and delivery solutions coming forward? So a little bit of kind of teaching you to suck eggs, just to remind you why we are where we are. But then what are the potential market approaches that are out there? And then talk about some actual case studies of where there's been some real success stories and what maybe we can learn from some of those. First of all, why are there new models being brought forward? Well, the first thing is demand. You know, there's a load of quotes I'm going to put up here around estimates around the need for new housing. We all know those, but it's actually quite scary how unsuccessful we have been at delivering on some of those targets. You know, right to buy, another thing I'd love to talk about, but if you look at the amount of right to buy, we all know versus what's actually been delivered against, trying to re-provide those units, it's really quite scary. And then you look at small house builders and the role they used to take pre-2007 and what they're now taking in terms of that is quite another thing to be scared about. And then I was just having a look at lunchtime at who are the biggest share drops today, and they are Persimmon, Taylor Wimpey, Barrett and Barclay, which tells you something else around where the potential tense points are coming. If we look at, you know, the typical employees in the development industry, you'll see about 15%-ish are non-UK origin in background. So there's quite a challenging environment before we even go into funding around how those things are going to respond in the coming months and years. The next is squeezed budgets, and this is around local government. I mean, we've got Newham in the room and others. It's been quite a scary environment for them as well. You know, in terms of grant funding, in terms of the way traditionally local authorities have been funded, obviously that's changed fundamentally, and the need for efficiency savings has been on top of each other again and again and again. And, you know, there's projected further cuts to come forward next year and obviously over and above that. What that's meant is a fundamental change in the way local authorities fund themselves, whilst also having bigger and bigger challenges around housing targets and the actions they can take around those. And it was interesting to hear Newham earlier talking about the fact, and Deirdre saying that, you know, they need to look at where they can get income from. And actually, one thing that the public sector is rich in is asset base. And that's what I want to talk a bit about today. Because there's ways in which, A, that can help deliver those targets, but B, it can also financially help those organisations. The next one to talk about is that point, income and development. Local authority financial position has never been more linked to development in its history. You know, if you look at new homes bonus, retention of business rates, city deals, and the way that actually central government has responded to some challenges from local authorities around giving them powers, devolving those powers to local authorities to control some of the things in their own areas. Now that's a really good message for those areas where they can do something about it and there's viability there around delivery, but it's actually very challenging for others. So that has led to the need for bespoke solutions, and it's something that we've seen really come forward over the last 7 or 8 years. We've done quite a lot of work with a number of authorities, central government and private developers around ways in which they want to work together in partnership to deliver solutions, tying together skill sets, powers, access to funds, appetite for risk, which is one of the key things I want to come back to, and desired outcomes. But there's a way in which to knit together the real strengths of the public and private sector to unlock development. And that's something we want to talk about, and some of the solutions I'll be coming on to will really be focusing on that kind of tension, but also the synergies between them. Now, if we think about a typical development, there's a series of roles. There's kind of investment and funding, how are we actually going to pay for the thing? There's actually development and construction, and there's management and operations. There's kind of broadly the roles that sit there. And the traditional model kind of threw all those in one box. And what we're now seeing is ways in which to cut those between partners. And actually, the authorities and the public sector and how they've responded to that, or the more forward-looking and proactive ones, has really where you've started to see some success stories. And that really comes back to, well, what are the key questions to answer for a public organisation to integrate with the private? And it's really around, well, what are the risks? Are we as an authority or a public body or as a public sector at large willing to take some risk? And if we are, we're not going to do it for no reward. We want to make sure that there's commensurate reward for the risks that we're willing to take. And the private sector need to, A, acknowledge that, and B, take advantage of it. You know, what we'll see in a typical development, one I've been working on recently, which had some EU funding, so I've been on a number of calls today, was basically that the public sector got great land asset. The private sector, in that particular example, really didn't want to pay for the land up front. Fundamentally, big funding challenge for them around paying for the land. So we're going to come on and talk about a joint venture solution. There was a question about it earlier. Well, if the public sector could invest their land alongside the private sector and share reward, there's no need to forward fund that land. They can share some of the infrastructure costs and share in the potential benefit. But clearly there's a risk there, so it's got to make sure it works overall. The second question is the level of control that the public sector might want. You know, typically if you're just going to go and sell a site, you've still got your planning powers, obviously, but you haven't got control over the ongoing development. If a council, for example, wants to have that control, it needs to develop a solution where it retains it. And all of those are knitted together with finance and funding. So by putting those three areas together, you can develop a delivery solution that works, hopefully, for both parties. So what are some of the potential approaches? I'm going to talk about some specific case studies in a moment, but here's some of them. Some of them will be buzzwords you'll know, some of them will be maybe new to you, but self-development's the obvious one. We've seen a number of authorities taking a step into the housing development area in particular, whether that be through a wholly owned company, within their HRA, other ways in which they're doing it. It varies across the board, but what we do know is the level of house building we need hasn't happened since the public sector was active in the industry. So it's fundamental in terms of that potential going forward. So I'm going to talk about some company solutions in a second. You've then got things like revolving investment funds, which is garbled on the screen, but you can more or less see it. Well, that's about, in some ways, trying to develop grant yourselves. It's about setting up a funding approach where you can fund into a potentially viable area in order to get some potential return to grant fund yourselves into other areas. It's taking a program approach across a number of different developments, and we've seen organisations like Croydon Council doing that, and Fife up in Scotland. There's a various number of those that I'm going to talk about. Joint ventures, I'll come on to in a second, and then a number of different investment type models as well, so I'll briefly talk about those. So case studies, against each of these, I could have put a number of authorities. I'm going to focus on these particular ones. First one's about partnership structure, a joint venture. Second one's around how Barnet have used a value capture model to deliver a station and Brent Cross Cricklewood development. Then I've got a lease-based model for Barking. I've seen a Barking person in the room, so he'll love that being on screen. Then we've got Croydon and a wholly owned company model as well. So I'll briefly talk about some of those. First one is a partnership structure, a little bit of a 101 here around how a partnership structure might work. For this, I'm just going to take affordable housing out for a second, because this is a residential one, and council are delivering, in this example, affordable housing themselves outside of a joint venture mechanism. But they're actually going to partner with a private sector developer on the private sector elements of the scheme. So they're going to have 50-50 shares in a joint venture structure. The council are then going to invest their land, as I mentioned earlier, and the partner are going to match that investment in cash. So if, let's say, £1 million worth of land value, we're going to put that into a joint venture and ask our partner to put cash in to match it. So they haven't got to pay for the land, but they're helping fund into a joint venture structure. Now, that's put in as a loan in this example, so they actually get a live interest rate on that from day one. So there's a revenue return to a council right from day one, so it helps their revenue position. They don't generally want capital receipts. It's revenue that the councils are really struggling with. Go and get some debt and then deliver the development and share the returns in it. That's the broad principle of that joint venture structure. In this particular one, they've also got the private sector developer to be the developer for the affordable element of the scheme. So they're just contracting with them to be a direct development partner, do the direct construction work. So when you pay them the construction profit. So it's a way in which they were able to take some risk, take some reward, and also deliver the affordable elements. Number of advantages and disadvantages of that. First one being, well, it enables a development pipeline because you can work with that partner on multiple sites if you procure it correctly. You can share the cost of infrastructure between the two partners, enable funding to be raised against assets, something which local authorities aren't allowed to do in their own right. They can do it through a company method. And then they can risk transfer between the partners. So there's a number of good things. Also a number of challenging things. It's quite expensive to set up something like that. You require you to invest your land, which you don't get a receipt for immediately. And then it's dependent on strong partnership with your partner. You could sign up to one of those, get involved with a partner, and things start to go wrong very quickly. And there's been examples of that out there too. So there's a number of positives and negatives around that. So it depends on the scheme and the risks, whether or not it's something you want to do. And it's something that Southend are doing currently on a major development near the centre of the town. Big 4 towers on that site, about 400 units currently. It's going up to about 1,200 units. And they're procuring a joint venture partner to do those things with it. It's got major infrastructure costs up front on that scheme, but the long-term value uplift and ongoing returns from it are potentially justifying getting a partner on board. And they've got a lot of interest in that scheme, and it's potentially PRS, so private rented sector housing, as well as private sale. So they get long-term rental streams and so on. So again, it's an example of where a partnership approach is something that might work in that environment. Now, the council could deliver that entirely on their own, but they're taking all the risk in that environment, and have they necessarily got the capacity and skills to do that? So they chose to work with a partner who might bring those to them. Second one I want to talk about is Barnet, which was, in essence, a value capture scheme. So it's the typical challenge we've been talking about today. Major infrastructure needed early in a scheme, and all the value coming much later in the scheme. So how on earth do you forward fund all of those works on the hope of returns coming later down the path? There's always risk versus reward in that example. And it's very difficult for one organisation to take all that risk in return for that reward. So it's all about designing something that tries to spread that risk. And you've seen examples through the City Deal process, the Northern Line extension here in London, and Barnet here, which I want to talk about now, which is Brent Cross Cricklewood itself. So Brent Cross Cricklewood, major regeneration scheme. People probably know Brent Cross Shopping Centre. Allied to that, to the south of that site is a very large area of relatively deprived, low quality housing that really needed significant investment. But the council actually signed up to a JV to cover all of that works. The top work to the shopping centre and all the work to the south site as well. Their partner actually decided they didn't want to do that in the end, decoupled that and just took the northern element of the site and left the council with the southern area to deal with. When the viability work was done on that, it was about £1 billion hole in viability for that south site. Fundamentally, the council had to go back to the drawing board and look at how can we deliver that site. And the biggest thing that was found was potentially a way they could answer that was actually by the new station that was potentially going there, which was to the left of the site there. It's a very broad picture, you kind of know where I am. What it showed was, the analysis they did, that actually if that could be brought forward early in the scheme, the potential uplift in value across the site from that happening would drive housing values up, of which the council owed significant elements of land, and also business rates that was going to be generated from the shopping centre and the southern site together was significant. So what they did is went with a deal to the GLA and the Treasury and said, right, if you put a red line around this site for a specific period of time, we will borrow and fund that station right at the start. If you let us use those receipts to pay back our borrowing. Now, clearly there's a risk to that, because what happens if the shopping centre doesn't get delivered on time, isn't as occupied, and all of those elements. So they did a lot of work risk adjusting and looking at that data. But by doing that, it fundamentally unlocked the site. It was agreed that potential approach, and now that's in the process of being developed. So it's by being a bit more innovative and going and speaking to central government in its various forms that actually and going through that process was quite an eye-opener for me, certainly since pre-2007, some of the discussions I had and post, fundamentally different and actually quite open for business discussions. And certainly the City Deal process, we've seen very similar things happening. So a way in which to come up with something a bit more innovative that actually helped unlock things was crucial in that particular scenario. The next one's the investment-led approach. Now, there are various forms of this, but basically how this is working is there are pension funds out there who aren't really getting particularly strong returns on the way that they're doing their investments, and so are looking at ways to invest in long-term income streams from property. So actually, there's been a number of examples of Viva, L&G, and others who've said, well, okay, let's look at ways in which we can work with public bodies around generating income streams that are relatively sure that give us long-term returns. And this is an example that was used in Barking and a few other authorities as well, where the council have a freehold interest in a load of land. They offer a long leasehold into a company, and that company goes to a funder who then procures a developer. So we literally we lease our land into an SPV, they lease it on to a funder who takes all development risk and goes and develops a load of units for us. But what we say is, you take the development risk, but if you deliver it to this quality, we will guarantee paying you an ongoing lease stream for a set period, let's say 30 years. Now, what the funder's got there is a guarantee of paying back its money. The council is signing up to a long-term payment, but they've received assets that are of an appropriate standard, and they then let them to tenants. And they work right at the outset on the business plan that says the income from those assets will pay for our ongoing lease payments to you. So they've got a long-term return back to our funder from those elements, and you've got the assets funded without doing it through the public sector balance sheet. Bit of a complex model, but it works very clearly and is in operation at the moment. There's risks to multiple parties there, but it's stitched together to deliver overall a business plan that is in the council's control, because these tenants here could be varied between affordable rent, social rent, or private rent, because it allows you to, if we're suddenly not getting enough income in, well, we can increase or decrease our rents. It's a way in which they manage the risk around that particular example. I'm going to brush over that because of time. The next one I want to talk about is wholly owned companies. So this is something, bit of a flavour of the month. Number of authorities we've worked with who are setting up wholly owned companies, in essence, to deliver either private rented housing, some affordable housing elements, or commercial uses and so on. So in this example, council sets up 100% owned subsidiary. In this one, it's a residential-led one, so they've got a load of affordable housing and a load of private housing that they're going to develop through that, whether that be private rent or private sale. They go and get a private sector contractor to deliver those units for them. They can get the same contractor to do both if they want. And there's a cross-subsidy model between those. In broad terms, that's how that kind of model might work. Could be purely private rent in order to get income to the council. Could be various ways in which you do that. We've seen this a lot on temporary housing, where a number of authorities really struggling with general fund costs and so on. So they go and use this type of model to go and purchase units and invest debt and equity into it in terms of getting return. Now, we've got one particular authority we're working with at the moment who's using this specific model on a brownfield site to deliver a series of temporary accommodation units alongside their other units, because it's saving the money in the general fund and it's helping them forward fund other elements of the site and infrastructure through these returns. So so they pay back their debt through rents and they pay back their equity through increase in value of the housing over time. So that's something that works over the overall business plan. Again, a couple of authorities that are doing that are South Cambridgeshire and Badger in Broxbourne. It's just an example of that wholly owned company model. But Sutton have got one. Croydon Council have just set up Brick by Brick, which is a development company on brownfield sites mainly. Barnet are looking one, and Wokingham have got one in place as well. Typical type of model that's out there. The last one I want to talk about is the revolving investment fund approach. And this is something that's been used on a number of brownfield sites. Croydon Council, again, are doing this one at the moment, which basically has a fund that's put in place that invests into various developments. And it does it on either a grant basis, an equity basis, or a debt basis. And what it tries to do is develop returns where it can to be able to unlock infrastructure onto brownfield sites and others on other sites. So it's a way in which to try and tie together a program of development. So a business case that asks for funding, you put funding into those developments, make a return, surpluses come out to the general fund and they get reinvested in grant terms to individual developments. It's a way of tying together an overall development program that you can engender grant for, basically. So the last thing I want to really say is trying to tie those things together as a program even above that. So if you look at Fife Council, they looked at a way in which to try and pull together multiple approaches to deliver their entire development program. Big challenges to that around fluid government policy, treatment of right to buy is one, pressures on social rents, and all of those issues are now the things that have happened today around Brexit. But also there's a lot of challenge around use of localism powers, powers of general competence. There's been some issues around legal precedent. But there's obviously opportunities as well around emergence of the PRS market in particular, and the model that's out there around developing income from those. So in this particular example, you've got a growth agenda for an authority and a delivery plan that sits behind that. And you can use joint ventures as part of that on specific sites. You can use council-led development and putting together affordable elements within that. You can also obviously dispose of sites and get your receipts as investment into other areas. And then you've got the revolving fund approach as well. And Fife Council, as I say, have done exactly that through the development company that they've set up to try and utilise a series of companies underneath that to deliver an overall programme across its development estate. There you go. I whistled through it as quick as I could. So hopefully we can pick up any questions in the panel. Thanks.